I would like to call the City of Wheat Ridge Planning Commission for March 21st, 2019 to order. Can I get a roll call, members, please?
Melissa Antol. Daniel Larson. Here. Janet Leo. Here. Scott Ohm.
Here.
Richard Peterson. Here. Jahi Sembai. Here. Vivian Voss.
Present.
The next order on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. Is there a motion to approve the order of the agenda? So moved. Can I get a second? Second. Let's vote and keep your hands up if you're voting yes for the agenda. Okay, the next item is to approve the order of the minutes of February 7, 2019. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I approve the minutes of
February 7th, 2019. Second? Okay. And just remind the newest members that you will be voting abstain. Okay. Since you don't have the electrical board. Okay, let's take a vote. This is for approval. Okay. Okay, this is the time for any person to speak, the citizen comment on only the agenda items. Is there anyone signed up to speak on tonight's agenda items, which is going to, there's no cases, there's only going to be a study session for the neighborhood revitalization strategy? Nobody. Okay. I will close the citizen comment. Now we move on to new business, the neighborhood revitalization strategy study session presentation.
So this will be a presentation that I will turn over here in a moment to the chairs of the steering committee and to our consultant group. Eric and Thomas are here with CZB. I think several of you were here when we did a study session with council based on an interim report. This whole process to update the neighborhood revitalization strategy is an update of a 2005 document. That original one predated even our comp plan. And given that it's been, almost 15 years, last year, council directed us to update that document, and it really serves as sort of an overarching policy guidance. In this case, it's really included a lot of public input on what's important to the community, what needs to change, what needs to stay the same, what makes Wheat Ridge different, are we generally sort of on track or not. Because we have a few new members and because we really want this to be a comfortable, sort of casual, collective dialogue, I thought maybe we'd start with just introductions really quickly, including staff, commissioners, consultant group, and the co-chairs as well, just so that everyone sort of knows who's here, who's speaking, and hopefully, usually we're at the dais, usually it's a little bit more formal setting, but we really want to hear what you have to say and what you're thinking of things tonight. So I'll start maybe. I'm Lauren Michalak. I'm the planning manager in the community development department.
Scott Ohm, Planning Commissioner, District 2.
Ken Johnston, I'm the Community Development Director.
Hello everyone, my name is Jahi Sembai. I am in District 1.
Good evening, my name is Dan Larson. I represent District 4.
Janet Leo, District 4.
So, Thomas Eddington with CZB Consulting. Eric Amy with CZB.
Vivian Voss, Commissioner, District 2.
Melissa Antol, District 3.
Richard Peterson, District 1.
So I didn't have any more introductory. Yeah, get the comfy chairs. Do you have any more introductory comments? Nope, we'll turn it over then to that end of the table.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so as we said, this is Thomas. I'm Eric. We are with CZB, retained by the city to update the NRS. We were part of the team that did the first NRS back in the middle of the last decade. Before we jump into our presentation, the co-chairs have a few things they'd like to share about the process and what we've been doing together from their perspective in the last 8 months, 7-8 months or so. So I'll turn it over to them.
Good evening. So again, I'm Rachel Hulteen, and I'm one of 3 co-chairs. And I just want to share with you a little bit tonight about the role of the steering committee in this process. The strength of any policy process in any city is the participation and engagement of the community itself. So last July, City Council impaneled 27 residents and business owners from the city, and Kathleen will share a little bit more about the demographics of the steering committee itself. We got to work immediately. I mean, they literally were like impaneled and you have a big meeting in 2 weeks. Since then, we have met a handful of times, both half-day workshops. We have had several 3 to 4 hour Wednesday night meetings. We've had a lot of work in between. So since last August, we have been doing several things. One, as a steering committee, we've identified that we bring our own lived experience in the community and our experience as business owners, parents, grandparents. So we're a filter of what it's like to care about the city. Somebody called us civic nerds the other night. So we're down to 26, but we're 26 civic nerds who are really committed to making sure Wheat Ridge is the best version of itself in the decade to come. We also then, when we're not meeting as a steering committee, we really turn around and look to both our own network of people we know in the community, but also work hard to ensure that we are reaching as many people as possible. And Corey will talk a little bit about specific strategies that we've used to make sure we're not reaching the same 100, 150 people, but really looking at the 1,000 to 2,000 people that don't normally get engaged in a process like this. A couple of other really important things that I like to point out. We are really fortunate to have CZB. I know the difference a little bit because I do some of this work professionally myself. CZB has, every time Wheat Ridge has said, no, this is who we are. This is our core identity, and we can't change that. Like, we just need to be the best version of that. CZB's done the hard work to figure out, like, well, what is that core version? I like to use the word quirky. Eric cringes a little bit when I say quirky, because planners don't like quirky. But we were just inherently quirky. But within our quirky is our character and our quality, and it can always be improved. And so these guys have worked really hard to find the pattern of quirky that's unique to us. And we've worked really hard to, in turn, engage our community and listen to one another. Our process has been really oriented not towards consensus building as a steering committee, but inclusion and diversity. So not for us all to agree, but rather to have a debate and discussion to make sure that all viewpoints are on the table and have been considered. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Kathleen, and she'll tell you a little bit more about the steering committee members.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, thank you, Rachel. So I wanted to give you guys some details and, as Rachel said, some demographics about our steering committee. So we were impaneled back on July 2nd. The city council took applications for the steering committee and 27 people applied, and city council decided to impanel all of us, which originally sounded like a really big, clunky, hard to manage group. And I was a little nervous, but as we got to work, what we did was we realized we had a really good representation of the city. Just some numbers for you because I am a civics nerd and I like the numbers. We had 4 people from District 1, 9 from District 2, 8 from District 3, and 4 from District 4. So we had some good representation. Amongst us, we had 10 business owners, and our tenure in Wheat Ridge ranged from 1 year to 58 years. We had 11 people that have been in Wheat Ridge for less than 5 years, and 7 people who have been in Wheat Ridge more than 20 years. So within that, how we manage this big steering committee is we broke into small teams, and each of those teams included people from at least 3 districts, at least 1 business owner, men and women, and at least 1 newer resident and at least 1 long-term resident. So within our little groups, we tried to mirror that same level of diversity. So the first thing we did, and Rachel spoke to some of this, is we first went out into the community. We went to our networks, and we went out to businesses. Anywhere somebody would let us sit down and host a little community meeting in coffee shops and restaurants, or I had one on my back porch. People had them in their living rooms. We just got people together and asked, what does Wheat Ridge need to do to be successful in 10 to 15 years? What do we need to get right? What do we need to fix? What needs to stay the same? And then we took some of that back and turned it into some scenarios where we went out and said, we heard people want this. If we can get this, what are we willing to give up for that? And they were just hypotheticals, but it was designed to get people thinking about the give and the get as we move forward. So we took all of that information back and we brought it to the consultants who worked some magic. And then we regrouped as a large group and had our big open house in December. It was in December, it was before the holidays at the rec center, and even with so much going on, we had about 120 people come. So we went from 27, we reached out, we got to 100, we got more input, and all of that was added to what we had already collected and passed on for more magic. And then we came back together as a steering committee, and we realized that amongst us there were people who had a little bit more time and a little bit more passion and energy, and some people that really didn't have as much time to spend on the steering committee, but we didn't want to lose anyone because we wanted to keep that diverse group and we wanted to keep all of those connections to our community. So we restructured again and we formed a working group, and these are the people who we spent a couple Saturdays together, we've spent several weeknights together, we broke into different types of groups, and we focused on different voices in the community that we wanted to make sure were heard, and Corey's going to talk about that a little bit. But based on approaching and cutting the group and cutting the strategy in different ways, we were able to really cast a big net to get as many voices and as many unique voices heard as possible, and that culminated with our survey that just wrapped up before this final round of open houses. And our goal with that survey was to try to get around 400 responses, unique responses from Wheat Ridge. Our stretch was 500, and we ended up getting 1,053 responses. So that was huge. And I think it speaks to getting a really diverse voice of Wheat Ridge and diverse information together to move forward successfully. So with that, I will pass things over to Corey.
Again, my name is Corey Stites. I live in District 3. I'm going to talk a little bit about the community outreach that we did to get the responses that we did for the survey, for the open houses, things like that. So as Rachel and Kathleen talked about, our steering committee was pretty diverse, but what we wanted was to get more than just the 27, 26 people in the room. So what we did was we broke into different demographic groups. So we broke into groups and we looked at the demographics in Wheat Ridge that are either underrepresented in our group or that we wanted to make sure that we were able to represent. So we looked at families, so that's families with school-age kids. So we were able to go through to the elementary schools, middle school, high school. We just had one of our open houses at Wheat Ridge High School. We got our cards out, our advertisements for the open houses and for the survey out in almost all the elementary schools, middle school, and the high school. So we were able to get outreach that way. We talked to new residents, people who lived here less than 5 years. We talked to long-term residents, people who lived here more than 10 years. We looked at renters as well as homeowners, and then we looked at seniors. We spent quite a bit of time at the Active Adult Center and at the Senior Resource Center, and then we looked for business owners. So we went to specific restaurants, coffee shops, things like that, to make sure that we were able to talk to as many different business owners as we could to get their opinions as well. We also used those networks that we developed in those groups to then push our survey results. So as Kathleen talked about, we started in small groups together, talking in restaurants, talking in bars, talking in coffee shops, talking in our back porches, different businesses, things like that. And we were only able to get to about 40 people, 36 people, something like that. But when we opened up to our December 2nd open house, we had 120 people because we pushed it into those networks to get all those people there. We were able to get some great feedback and then turn our list that we were able to collect in our 36 people, our 120 people, all the people we had talked to along the way, shared with their networks, and we were able to get that survey out. And as Kathleen mentioned, the goal at the beginning was about 400 or 500 people. The CCB consultants said, that's a really good target number. Most places we go to that are about this size, that's what we're going to get. And I think everybody in the room collectively said that's just not going to fly in Wheat Ridge. We just know some of the distrust, some of the things that happened in the past. So what we said is we want to double that. So we looked at trying to get 1,000, and we doubled it. We got 1,053. So that was fantastic responses. In those surveys, we then, at the end of it, talked about our open houses that we had this week. So I know I saw a few of you at some of those open houses, but we presented at council, made sure we let everybody know about that. But we had 4 open houses at varying times. So we started as early as 7:30 in the morning, and we ended last night at Colorado Plus at about 8 o'clock. So we tried to make sure that everybody in Wheat Ridge could come see the results, give us some more feedback. Some of the boards over here were used during those open houses. So if you guys get a chance, take a look at those. But those 4 open houses, we had about 95 people come through the last couple of days. So it's been a real pleasure getting to know and getting to talk to a lot of those citizens. So we want to thank, as a steering committee, not only everybody who on the staff and everybody who had helped us out, but we want to thank all those citizens who came out to help us as well. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Great. So we recognize we're at the pivot point where we're going into the final phase of the NRS. When we gave this little spiel on Monday, it was before all of our open houses. So this is our 6th NRS event this week, so please bear with us if we're a little glassy-eyed. But it's been really wonderful. I would say we actually attracted about like a quarter of the people who came through this week actually had not come to the first open house. So we learned we can keep reaching people. Everyone who's come to an open house or taken the survey is a more involved citizen by that act alone. And as a steering committee, we've set a really high bar for ourselves because we recognize that whatever good work happens between now and when the NRS is adopted, we're going to assume it's going to get adopted, but the real work starts the next day. And so we've been really committed to build trust in the process, commitment to the process, and expectations for implementation, because we have 26 people who are highly vested in the process, who have been, we thought we'd be down to about 15 people by now, but we've really only lost 1. So I think that speaks highly of how well that's gone, and it couldn't have gone that well without great partners, city staff, great consultants. These guys I've seen more of them than my 13-year-old son this week. But just so you guys know, we recognize in civic processes like this, if our community doesn't have the faith and trust in the process, whatever good work comes out of it is vulnerable. And so we've really set that bar high so that we've got a really robust final product. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my other family members who have seen a lot of this week. And we'll hang out in case you guys have any questions for steering committee, but it's really their show from here.
I'm going to echo all of Rachel's various caveats about being tired. But we're right, yeah, the introverts are really struggling tonight. But we're happy to be here. We're excited to be here, so thanks for having us back again. Okay, so the remainder of there's sort of 2 parts to this presentation. Just a bit of more detail and more color on the process update that Corey, Kathleen, and Rachel just ran you through. They did a great job. We just have a few things to add to that. And then the real substance of tonight is the emerging directions. We're not here with the final presentation tonight. This is sort of I don't know, bottom of the 7th inning, top of the 8th inning kind of check-in before we go write the final document, which will be ready for public review in early May. So we're certainly excited to get your questions, looking forward to your questions. There will be a lot of potentially specifics that we're just not ready to, we're just not there yet. We're not here to tell you what's going to happen so much as we're here to sort of bounce these emerging ideas off of you and get your comments and feedback on that. Insofar as there are specific things you could speculate about down the road, we'll do our best, and certainly the staff who has that more local expertise is here to help with that as well. And then we'll assume kind of go to Q&A and discussion. You don't have to read all this stuff. I know it's hard to see, but this is our timeline. So this project kicked off in July. It really got underway with the committee in August. We spent the first few months kind of getting in rooms like this, writing on the wall like that, as we got started. Getting a sense of getting to know each other and understanding what the main ideas were, and then started to take those ideas out into the community to find out if we were on the right track. You know, what are the big things you got to get right? So there were, as the co-chairs described, just a number of meetings like this. This is a Saturday morning at Bardo with maps and just talking in small groups, getting ourselves back together as a committee again to debrief. And then that brought us into November, where we spoke to you and City Council in a joint session, shared some information then. And all that was really building toward a major milestone, which was the open house in December. So we were doing some sharing, telling, but also a lot of seeking input. So we shared the committee work, the results of that, spirited discussion amongst friends.
Guy looks like he's going to kill me, doesn't he?
But with love. He's going to kill you with love. Yeah. Okay. So, we also were seeking a lot of input that night as well. It was really important for us to be, it was one of those sort of do or die times. You know, if we were not on the right track in early December, we needed to know that. And so that was the point of that night. And the community was really helpful. As Corey pointed out, over 100 attendees that night helped us understand, were we focusing on the right things? Were we thinking about this project the right way? We also did something that was really fun that night, which was asked attendees to map their own neighborhoods. So we handed out these maps of the city and said, draw what you think your neighborhood is and tell us what you think your neighborhood is called. Because if you ask yourself those questions as a person who lives in Wheat Ridge and knows Wheat Ridge, you might kind of see why that's a fun thing to explore. There's no one set of Wheat Ridge neighborhoods. There's no one set of Wheat Ridge neighborhood names. Everyone has different ideas about how that all works. So 85 people did those maps for us, and the results were kind of cool. We'll talk about that later. Then again, another Saturday morning, locking ourselves in a room that was too small for the size of the group and hashing through what did the community tell us on the evening of December 12th, I think it was. What do these maps say? What do these maps mean? What kind of input did we get? What does that mean for the key issues? What does that mean for direction? And that was all snowballing toward our community survey, which, as we talked about, we uploaded all of that to the survey, and we got 1,000 people to answer our questions, which, again, another just rich data set for us. Advertised it as widely as we thought we could. City website, social media. This was an ad that ran in the Gazette back in February. We customized flyers and handouts for different audiences. Here's one for senior citizens. Here's one for business owners, to try to make each different constituency that we could identify feel like we were specifically talking to them. And that's kind of brought us to where we are this week in March, sharing these preliminary ideas with council, with community, and with you here tonight. Before we get into what those really are, there's just a bit of framing that we want to put on the table here so everybody understands. First of all, you know, this is a bit of a summary briefing, so it's not every single thing we could tell you. We don't have 7 hours to be here tonight. There may be 7 hours to tell, but we're trying to give you the highlights. But more importantly than that, the way that we're thinking about this project is the way that our firm tends to think about planning in general, which is that it's really about figuring out the fewest and most important items to deal with. It's not every single thing you could deal with. It's not a laundry list. It's not a Christmas list of all the things that need to, all the opportunities to be leveraged or all the issues to be addressed. It's really about focusing on the things that matter. So we talk a lot about Pareto. Pareto was an Italian mathematician and engineer born in the late 19th century, but and famous for a number of mathematical concepts and philosophical ideas. But the thing that he's probably most famous for is the 80-20 rule, which many of you might know. And so we're always asking the question, what is the 80-20? And the 80-20 rule basically says that 80% of your outcomes or your effects come from 20% of the efforts that you put in, right? So it helps you understand where to focus. And if you invest in 20% to get the 80% outcomes, that's a good thing, right? That's high efficiency, that's high leverage, it's good ROI. And often what we see in planning work and in city government and city government work and anything that involves large groups of people is it tends to devolve to what we call the 20/80 space, which is a lot of things to do that actually don't have much impact at all. Like, how big can we make the list, and how small of an effect will that list have? That's the direction that we often end up going. So we try to stay away from that. So in brief, sticking within the umbrella and the theme of the 80-20, here's sort of the bottom line of what you're going to hear tonight. We took the pulse of the community as a big part of what this project was about. And what we found out was that Wheat Ridge is pretty satisfied with how things are going. That's a really, really important finding. It doesn't want or require a whole lot of change, but there are a couple things that we've identified that are the big things. A desire for neighborhoods to self-manage change at the neighborhood level specifically. And we'll talk about how some process improvements that we think could help with that. And it's got a desire for improved corridors around the city, which as planning commissioners and residents of this town is probably not a big surprise. But that is a pretty well-worn path to getting those things done, planning and capital work, and business incentives as well. Now we're going to kind of share with you, through this format, a lot of the information that's sitting behind us and that have been talking about with everybody this week as we've been doing the open houses for what we call Blitz Week. So this is a series of survey results. Some of these are going to be from the city's resident survey that took place last year, and some are going to be from the NRS survey that we did. Every point that we're sharing here sort of corroborates the others, and they're all kind of important to share. And this is sort of the overall, how do you feel about living in Wheat Ridge? And the numbers are good, right? Quality of life is good. Rating this as a place to live, good. How has Wheat Ridge progressed over the past 5 years? And we asked people to consider factors like quality of life, appearance, shopping and dining options. 58% say it's gotten better in the past 5 years. That's a really important thing, we think. It says that Wheat Ridge is on the right track. The bottom half of this slide is based on a question that we often ask. We often actually do it in interviews when we're interviewing for projects, is we go to the whiteboard or the flip chart or whatever it is we've got, and we draw a line. And one line is sort of straight ahead, another is a slight deviation, and another is a dramatic U-turn, going back in the other direction, and say, which of these paths do you think your community needs to be on? And we asked some version of that question here, and 72% of people said, you know, we're on the right path, or maybe minor adjustments, but overall pretty good. Quality of life amenities, 70% good or excellent. How do you rate your neighborhood? 79% good or excellent. How well do your neighbors maintain their properties? 79% said either exceptionally well or to a good standard. That was a really important number as well, and we'll talk more about that later. Back to the big things. So this is one of the important themes that probably is no surprise to you and just smacked us in the face right off the bat, is that, you know, Wheat Ridge, a lot of these numbers here are the result of good work on the part of the city council, good work on the part of the city staff. There are people who have made good decisions that have resulted in good things happening in this community that people feel good about. But it's also the case that some of it is just the market has gotten better. Denver's gotten very hot, as we all know. The real estate market has, I don't think rebound is even the right word. It's been on a really incredible trajectory, right? And so that's had impacts on Wheat Ridge. So it's become desirable. Real estate values have risen. That has effects. People decide, well, wait a minute, if my house is worth 2 or 3 or 4 times what I paid for it, right? Or it's worth 50% more than I paid for it 3 years ago. Now all of a sudden the gears start turning about how can I maximize my use of this property? How can I maximize its value, right? Can I make some investments in my house that I might not have made back in 2003 or 2006 even? And that's resulted in some physical changes, and those physical changes can be uncomfortable for people, especially if you lived on a street or a block where there's been a long period of time where you haven't seen change, and now all of a sudden you're seeing change. This is really the main question, because change is constant in life. There's no such thing as preserving a place in amber, right? So it's how do we effectively manage it? This is one of those ideas that, as I said a few minutes ago, is yet to be totally fleshed out and detailed out. But the idea of a neighborhood planning program that does a few things in terms of helping to manage change. One is to give a more organized voice to neighborhoods in decision making. Another is to allow for discussions of city issues at a more manageable scale. So every single conversation doesn't have to be at city council. Every single conversation doesn't have to be an entire city of Wheat Ridge conversation. There can be things that can be dealt with at a smaller scale, on a more hyper-local level. It might be more appropriate to do that. Things that might be seen as more positive, I guess you might say, are that there's a desire in this city to have more distinct neighborhood identities. People want to feel like they are a part of a place that is bigger than their own house, but smaller than the entire city of Wheat Ridge. There's something that feels good as people about saying, you know, my neighborhood, I'm from this neighborhood. In my neighborhood, we have these traditions, we do these things. That's come through in our feedback and the input we've gotten from the community. And just providing a platform for building connections. There's a lot of feedback we've got that people value the small town feel of Wheat Ridge. Part of that is, or a lot of that might be actually, having bigger neighbors on every side of you and feeling like we're a small place. We're a place where we know each other, we know our neighbors, we can really wrap our arms around it. It makes sense from a scale point of view. And neighborliness is certainly a part of that as well. And there's been desire for that that's come through. Again, here's just some information from the surveys to back that up. The clear desire to celebrate sort of small town life where people know their neighbors. 76% of people said uniquely tailored initiatives by neighborhood is a good idea. And 79% said it's time to engage or re-engage neighborhoods on issues that affect them. And 62% of people said they would participate in a new neighborhood organization if they don't currently have one. So that's a positive sign as well. Again, back to that sort of desire to be neighborly, get involved with people, be social. We can talk more about this in the Q&A about what this actually could look like. There are a number of models, probably literally dozens, if not hundreds across the country, going back 40, 50 years for neighborhood planning, neighborhood engagement. And the neighborhood mapping exercise, one of the things we were thinking about is having this idea in our brain was how would you actually put it on the ground? How would you deploy it? Certainly understanding that while there might be a sort of city-led framework that feels top-down at first, that there's also got to be, it's just a bottom-up activity, right? When you're talking about neighborhoods and you're talking about groups of neighbors, that's not something that somebody who's in City Hall is going to manage neighbor relationships, right? That's just defies logic. But we are looking for a way to potentially get it kick-started. And one way we might do that is to subdivide the city into, I think what we call them neighborhood planning districts, maybe, for lack of a better description at this moment. But that would provide at least a geography to get this kind of thing started. And those blue lines and those names that you can't read on that screen are just one attempt. You could interpret those 85 different maps up above, I'm sure, a number of different ways. We just took a stab at one and shared that with the community for the purposes of explaining the concept. And as Rachel said earlier too, this presentation was really built and designed before we had done all these open houses this week, before we had the council conversation. And so we've gotten more information and more feedback that we can, use to describe and talk more about what we heard from people, how they responded to it, and how they felt about it. This is the next big issue. This is corridors. Again, no surprise that there's just been a lot of work that's gone on in Wheat Ridge, going back at least a decade, if not longer, in corridor improvements. Whether it's 38th Avenue or Wadsworth Boulevard, a lot of that stuff is well underway. So, but it's not done yet citywide, and people let us know that. So just the resident survey and our NRS survey just reinforced the need to improve corridors. A lot of that is visual appeal. It's everything from potholes in the middle of the road to collapsing curbs to lack of landscaping to unsightly signs. And a lot of it also is just like business development, right? So on 44th, on Wadsworth, on Kipling, could we have better restaurants? Could we have better shopping options? That kind of stuff. So they fall into both categories. This is just a shot of the board that you see over here behind Corey, which you can peruse later. I was scrolling through photos we took from 3 other open houses, and I would say they're not all the same, the responses, but this is a pretty good representation. It's not far off the mark. So if you want to see the input, more specific input and feedback that we received about what kinds of improvements are needed in these particular corridors, and these are the corridors that have been identified by the community through our work to date as needing the most immediate attention, the soonest attention as well. In case you can't read that, I'll just orient you. So the blue stripe is Youngfield, the yellow stripe is 44th over as far as Wadsworth, and then the rest of 44th from Wadsworth headed toward Denver is the red. And that green stripe is Kipling from 38th up to I-70. So those are really the big ticket items that have come out of this process and that we think represent high leverage opportunities going forward. But we would be remiss if we didn't talk about a couple other things. And these are 2 sort of examples. These are not an exhaustive list of everything else that this final document will cover, but they represent 2 categories of issues. Property conditions and code enforcement is one example of something where we raised it as consultants. We came in, and I think if you remember back in November, we really, the nature of that conversation was really sort of about our findings, our data findings, what we were seeing in the market, and that dominated that conversation because we didn't have all this really great community input yet at that time. So many things hadn't happened yet. So it was kind of, here's our objective look, right? And one of the things that we raised was property conditions and code enforcement, something we often raise when we're doing revitalization work in nearly any community. And we thought that was important, and we'll talk about what happened after we thought it was important, and ADUs as well, which is something, it's a hot button topic that's been facing the city as it's become sort of more commonly known about and more commonly inquired about. So this is the thing we talked about back in November. We raised these issues of single-family homes turning over to rental, issues of property conditions that seem too uneven, in our opinion, around the city. We shared this information about conversions of older housing to rentals, raised the idea of more robust code enforcement or potentially rental inspection program or some new tools that might help to sort of get a handle on these things. And what we found, again, was that this was a bee that was in our bonnet as consultants because it's sort of the stuff we're trained to look for. And the more we tested it with the community, the more we heard, yeah, this isn't really a thing that we're too worried about. It doesn't mean that there isn't somebody on a street somewhere who's really mad, because the person across the street isn't doing what she thinks he ought to do. It doesn't mean that you give up on code enforcement efforts or you cut that function out of your government. Keep doing it. but largely it's probably stay the course, some incremental improvements, some more targeted surgical changes or new initiatives maybe that could be played out through the neighborhood planning process. But it's just not something that there's a lot of will or desire, quite frankly, to overhaul and do a lot more of. We just didn't get a lot of real support for something like a rental inspection program, which the city has considered in the past, a couple of times at least, and decided not to pursue. That's not changing. Additional code enforcement resources or new tools, not really, it's not something people are crying out for. So we wanted to put this in the presentation to share, number one, sort of the overall idea that there are certain things that we would have brought in at the beginning that fell off the table through this process. And also that point two is it would probably be conspicuous in its absence if we didn't make some comment about it. Accessory dwelling units are that other category of things that we think actually kind of fall into the 2080 space. It's an issue that is of the moment, but we actually don't see a lot of bang for the buck on ADUs from a policy perspective. Once you get a best practices ordinance in place, once you figure out the financing and the construction and all that stuff, there just likely aren't going to be that many built. And so the impact in the housing market is relatively small. Again, it doesn't mean there aren't individual families or households that would benefit from that. But in terms of a citywide policy and a citywide conversation that sucks up oxygen from other things, our objective view as consultants is we wouldn't spend a lot of time focusing on it. But that being said, we're committed to providing some additional information and comment on this in our report. And we actually spent some time this week asking the community about it and learned some interesting things, I think. Maybe Thomas can talk about that in the Q&A. Anyway, just a rundown. These may be numbers that you know off the top of your head, or maybe not, but these are the resident survey numbers on ADUs. 48% were in support, more or less. 22% were opposed, more or less. And 30% were either neutral or didn't know. But we were really keen to explore this category of, well, it depends. We've heard so many times in this project that Wheat Ridge always needs to have a none of the above option when you ask a question, right? And we decided, and we're like, okay, we get that, but what about it depends? And so we had a lot of fun this week with the it depends category on ADUs, if you want to learn more about that. We did learn, though, that on this particular topic, there's a real strong desire to sort of keep talking about it, keep figuring it out. Some people are very knowledgeable about the idea of ADUs. Some people are not knowledgeable at all. There's just a real range of understanding. And so the more that, to the extent the city really wants to pursue figuring this out, there's just sort of got to be some more education around it. So that pretty much brings us to the end. Where we are in terms of next steps is that after tonight, we will go take all of this, all the input that we got, the feedback we got from council, questions from council, feedback, questions from you as well, and bake that into everything we think we already know and start preparing a draft strategy, which will be, again, as I said, available for public review in the early part of May. So that's it, and with that, we're opening up to questions and conversation.
Go ahead. No, it's fine. This is more informal.
Okay. Well, I was just curious, so what does the strategy actually entail? Is it recommendations on next steps to pursue any of those kind of major buckets you just went over? It's kind of like, this is what would be the next step to implement or advance that.
That's exactly right. It gives us an opportunity to take all of this information, kind of put it together, synthesize it, do an analysis. And again, we have tons of raw data, quantitative data, but now we have a significant amount of qualitative data. We've got the input from the community, so we can start to make the recommendations and kind of help the community understand what a set of priorities might be to move forward as well.
Included in that, do you talk about like timing and investment requirements for that? Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, so the,
The hard question.
there's, all this stuff has a lot of implications. So first of which is time. These things all represent big efforts that don't get done overnight. So there's always a discussion of sequencing and how soon and what comes first, and certainly budgeting as well. So the corridors alone, there could be $100 million of capital work, that would be expended from 8 years from now to 15 years from now, let's say. There could be staffing implications, right? There's a lot of resource implications, and we make sure to touch on that whenever we write a report like this.
If I may, excuse me, just answer from a staff perspective. When the NRS was adopted in 2005, and I'm sure the 2019 version of that will look completely different, but when it was adopted in 2005, I started just about a year and a half after that in my position, and it was really kind of a driving factor in why I took the job, because it was a really pretty aggressive and progressive roadmap for things that needed to get done and change for the community to be successful. So I think, like I said, I'm sure it'll look very different, but I would expect it to, with council's support, really inform a decent portion of our work program for the next 5 to 10 years.
I just wanted to make a general comment that this is quite a different presentation than the first one was. The first one just kind of had me on edge, and I'm like, what's going on here? But this one, because I feel it's different because the citizens have spoken, and they have given their thoughts on this. And from a personal point of view, I'm pleased with how the citizens have responded, because obviously that's my thinking also. I think that we've always had a lack of communication within the neighborhoods, within the city, with what's going on, with who's doing what, where, how, why. And it seems like from the presentation, with 1,000 survey responses, 100 people at meetings, that these 25 people that are on the steering committee need to be on staff, because it seems like they've done such a good job with working the system, getting the communication, whether it's cards or just meeting the one-on-one. It's just seemed really wonderful to see that kind of communication and outreach happen. So I would encourage that. The only question—
Could I just address one thing to that point? I just have to tell you, when we first started, and there were 27 people on the steering committee, we just about hit the floor. We thought, what are they doing, right? And we have to tell you that the steering committee has been extraordinary. The amount of work that these guys have put in, Corey, Kathleen, Rachel in particular, and the entire steering committee has been extraordinary. And their ability to maintain public outreach, to garner support, to engage in dialogue, both agreement and disagreement, has been through the roof. It is unlike anything we have seen, and I think it is testament to their outreach that the survey has been so successful, as well as the open houses. So we just have to say that up front. It is rare that we see steering committees engage so much, and it is rare, never, that a 27-person steering committee has engaged so much, and so it's been pretty extraordinary. I mean, we've had the opportunity, to your point, since the last time we were here, to kind of engage this community. We've had the opportunity to explore it a whole lot more. I mean, we're starting to explore the inner sanctum of Wheat Ridge. I've been able to, I like Apple Jacks, I like Molly's. I get to take nice bottles home to Utah that I can't get there. We're hanging out at sunrise, sunset. I get my breakfast every morning. Sneak over to Molly's farm. Five Ridges Farm, and I want to steal her dog, Leia. And so, I mean, we've really been able to kind of understand the community from a completely different perspective. It's really because of the steering committee. So to your point, that quantitative data comes out, but so does the qualitative data as well. Yeah. Oh, Amanda, that's what I was thinking, not Molly. Yeah.
Yeah, these guys have been rock stars. I don't remember a project where the committee has performed like this one has. The level of commitment and the heavy lifting, and also just the ability to constantly adjust on the fly and be nimble, right? I mean, I feel like we throw out the playbook, half a dozen times probably in this project, to the benefit of the project, I think, always trying to get it right. But there is, on the one hand, the effort that this committee has put forth since last summer is very hard to replicate. It's very hard to maintain that level of energy and sustain that commitment on a volunteer basis. However, but I want to put that in a box and set it aside for a minute. I think the lessons that we learned through this process about how to engage the community, how to get to different audiences, how to just continuously work it until you get it right, is hopefully some kind of model from which we can extract lessons going forward, whatever that ends up looking like.
Well, I think you can replicate that steering committee by keeping that steering committee somehow highly involved with moving forward on this. And I just had one question that I did not understand what a node was. If you want to explain that.
So I think it was probably in reference to commercial nodes. And so basically what that is kind of a center, a little bit of a district, if you will, of maybe retail or restaurant activity, something to that effect, typically is what we think of as a node of activity. So think of it as a center, a point of activity. It's probably planner geek speak, so we apologize. Okay.
Like clustered instead of strung out in a
Right.
linear way.
Right.
I have geek speak sometimes too.
And within the context of this project, what it was really referring to was like your neighborhood coffee shop, your neighborhood bar, place where you walk down the street to meet your friends. It's kind of shorthand.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I have it's a kind of big question, and it's for the consultants, it's for the committee, and it's for the staff here. I was struck by this in November, and I'm still struck by this. I've been involved in planning projects before in relatively small places. The last time I did it, I was in an isolated small town. You're not. You're in the context of the dynamic metro area. And I'm wondering how that's entered into and how it will enter into what Wheat Ridge can actually do on its own. You can't build a wall. You can't keep developers out. I mean, sitting on the Planning Commission, I haven't kept score, but most of the people who've walked in that door and presented development plans have not been citizens of Wheat Ridge. They've been from the metro area. They've been from cities far, far away. So I'm just wondering from all of you, how do you handle the fact that you're in this dynamic, fast-moving Denver metro area? How do you isolate Wheat Ridge in that?
Does anybody want to volunteer to tackle that very, very big question? Or is that for us?
It's for all three parties.
I would say a couple of things. I think that one, it's not that, I think that you would want to or you could be able to isolate what goes on in Wheat Ridge. Of course, you have an impact on all of those around you. The surroundings have an impact on you. And so I think recognition of that is important to your point, right? Two, I would say that setting up and preparing the city, the planning department in particular, with the right tools, the right toolbox. There's a number of tools that go in this box, right? But making sure that we have the right planning tools, the right design tools. I mean, if when we were discussing corridors, for example, some of your corridors are ultimately controlled by CDOT, right? They're going to be the ones who play a large role on that, not just external communities, as I think you were referring to, but external jurisdictional authorities as well. And so how can we create a toolbox that can work with them and give us the result that we want to have, right? If we go into those discussions and we don't know where it is we really want to land, we don't have the guidelines, we don't have the planning methodology, we don't have the plan, we don't have a visualization of where we want to land, any path will take us there. So I would say that part of this project is actually setting and defining that path where you start to get into the specifics and say, this is what we want. And you have to get pretty specific. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% of the community and or the planning commission or the city council that it does agree with that, right? But you hope you get near 70, 80% that are like, that's generally the direction we want to go. That's what we intend to bring, is that direction, that toolbox, that prioritization.
The other thing is, the shorter answer to your question is you can't.
Right.
You can't isolate your city in the middle of a dynamic metro area and keep stuff out. It doesn't work that way. There is no, like I said before, there's no preserving a place in amber, especially when it's subject to forces that are so large and beyond our local control, right? But as a matter of civic life, as a matter of politics, there can be, there are ways to, we think, respond to what we're hearing from, if it's not, a majority, it's a sizable minority that matters in Wheat Ridge, which is we just feel like we aren't getting enough of a say. We just feel like, and that's not a knock on the city necessarily, it's a response to the world, right, that is sort of making change happen, those big forces. There are ways to help provide a better sense of agency. I don't want to say control, because control is not the right word really, right? But to participate in the management of these things to the positive benefit of the community that we love. The cost to that very often is efficiency, right? But there are times when cities make decisions, say, efficiency is not our number one goal. It's not our bottom goal, but it's not our number one goal either, right? I spent 5 years working for the city of Boulder. Boulder long ago made a decision that efficiency is not its number one goal, right, in terms of managing development in its town. Just one example, and there are many, many others. Thomas used to be the planning director in Park City, Utah. He probably has more stories than I do about that kind of stuff. But that's it. It's how do you facilitate a community conversation in a sustained and meaningful way around these issues, right? That's kind of what we're getting at. And I think everybody in this room has a role to play in that.
But do you sit down with Edgewood and talk about how you can work together? Is there MetroThink involved?
There is certainly on certain issues, but before I maybe answer that, maybe give you my perspective on your initial question. I mean, I think I would agree with both Eric and Rachel that you can't, right? I mean, the market is what the market is, but I agree with Rachel in that we identify ourselves as a quirky city. We have a department mission statement, and it almost had quirky in it. So it ended up with unique, which is, I guess, a little more, right. So I think what we view our work as is, knowing that a lot of the real estate pressures are always going to be part of a large metro area. Obviously we've seen a lot of housing investment in the city in the last several years, and a lot of that is just frankly spillover from an overbuilt Highlands, right? Or at least part of it is, right? And so for us, I think it's managing too quirky in a regional real estate market, managing density that's appropriate, what we think for our community versus what might be appropriate in Denver. I think another way that we, kind of function in the regional markets realities is demographics, right? And how we manage an expectation that coming out of this process and has come out of processes before where why can't we have more restaurants? Why can't we have more cool shops? And some of that is demographics, right? So I use the now developed Lucky site as maybe a good example, maybe a bad example, but you know, when that was when that went vacant and was being considered at one point for a Walmart, but prior to that, you know, we had heard from people, why can't we get a Trader Joe's? Why can't we get a Whole Foods? Why can't we get a Nordstrom? And I'll tell you, I mean, we went to all those groups, not Nordstrom, but because that just wasn't going to happen. We certainly went to Whole Foods. We certainly went to Trader Joe's and pitched that site. And, you know, you can't tell their corporate real estate board that to locate there, right? And the same thing happens when you're competing for restaurant groups, right? We reach out to all the local restaurant groups, you know, Frank Bohannon's group, the Larimer group, I mean, all the cool restaurant groups, and it's just hard to get them to come with the, you know, quirky concept without being able to, you know, show them the demographics. Doesn't mean we can't. I mean, you just have to keep working hard at it and foster local businesses that we've been able to have some cool ones as well. So you're right. We do definitely, you know, function in a regional real estate market, but I think we can manage it to Wheat Ridge's desires in a lot of ways.
I might just add my 2 cents. So I think one of the things that came out of the 2005 document that I'm not sure that you never sort of fully achieve it is how do you manage change? So I think part of this is reframing the questions, right? So if you ask the question, do we want to grow? The answer is going to be no. Do we want to change? The answer is going to be no. But if you're asking the question, if we're going to have to grow, where should it happen? Or if we're going to have to change, how do we want that to look? And I think the answer to those questions are different in every community. And the answers to those questions are sort of what defines our community, Wheat Ridge's reactions. So I think it's about managing the change that we know is going to happen and reframing those questions. And then similar to sort of what everyone else has said, I heard something recently, great cities don't just happen. So again, sort of taking agency in that and highlighting, I think Kathleen was talking about trade-offs, right? Making that sort of forefront in the discussion. So great cities don't just happen. What are the values of Wheat Ridge? What makes it unique? What are we willing to give to get that, right? Some of it's going to be in our control and some of it's just not. But trying to reframe, I think, some of those really hard discussions and really hard external factors to steer our ship in the direction that the community wants to go.
Do you mind if I add a little bit to that? So a narrative that has a great story from yesterday. So our 4 open houses, we had one at the Active Adult Center on Tuesday morning, and it was mostly, I would say, the average age was 67-year-old ladies. Like pretty consistently. And then we were at Wheat Ridge High School, and it was 67-year-old gentlemen. And then we had a random assortment of people at Wheat Ridge Rec Center yesterday morning, and then we were at Colorado Plus last night. And through that parade of open houses, we really kind of saw the spectrum of Wheat Ridge's rich heritage and like passion for, you know, sky and land and water and like deep community roots, and people have known each other for generations and multi-generational families coming through, and you could just feel that like web of interconnectivity, and it's what made me fall in love with the city and what makes me do things like a year-long commitment to the NRS. But then last night at Colorado Plus, the first couple who came through, you know, she's wearing a baby, he's got a pink backpack, they're drinking beer. And, you know, we saw this parade of like, these are the people who are going to grow into the adoption of this NRS. And so this document needs to be kind of flexible for being adopted today to reflect, you know, who we are and making sure that those core visions and values that make Wheat Ridge so uniquely quirky and unique and quirky, you can be both, that those carry forward to some extent, because we've all bought into that, and we might have slightly different interpretations, but that's our Wheat Ridge. The word agency is, I think, the key to it. From the residential perspective, which is what we pretty much all share at this table, you know, our agency starts at the end of our driveway, and that's where, you know, we care the most about our sidewalk or our lack of sidewalk in front of our house. And our agency of concern weakens the further it gets from our hub of activity in our personal life. And so the city, when you're looking at its role in the region, the idea of going into neighborhood level or neighborhood districts allows us as residents to have that passion and agency and in a more specific context that we feel like we're not losing that control to the metropolitan area. Meanwhile, we need our nodes and our corridors to function like they need to be functional. Like there's just a pulse that needs to work regardless of what I like in front of my own house. So that agency kind of transfers a little bit from the individual to the collective as we go from the neighborhood to the corridors and nodes. And I think that that's where we're going to see that balance of like Wheatridge's Wheatridgeness needs to really like flourish at that neighborhood district level, and maybe loosens a little bit when we get on some of our margins. But our margins look different. Like Applewood's edge to Lakewood is very different than East Wheatridge's edge to Denver. And I think that's why these districts are an interesting concept. So that's just been my experience.
If I might, and this, I'd like to address this one more to the staff. A bit of context, it's actually a two-part question. A bit of context, though, on 2005, and Ken, you just mentioned you were around, when the first iteration of this neighborhood revitalization effort. The context was that, I understand, is quite a bit different. Times were different. Wheatridge was different. After the city went through that process, how did the change manifest? Were there changes in the code? I know there were some new zoning appellations that were implemented, and we come across those periodically. What were some of the other changes that directly resulted from the initial survey?
Maybe Lauren and I both take a crack at this, but I mean, there were, 13 specific recommendations? I mean, it's a complex document, the way the first NRS is organized, but it has a long to-do list. Lauren mentioned that one of the recommendations is kind of fundamentally and maybe overarching is that we needed to reevaluate how we manage change, right? We had a community that was very resistant to change and in fact had cooked that resistance into their regulatory documents, notably their zoning code, and to a great extent their charter. That charter has not changed by and large. It has changed in one regard, but so that was kind of the overarching approach, is that we just had to really create a regulatory environment that was more allowing of change. So what did that mean? Well, we developed a new comprehensive plan in 2009, which serves as a policy document, not a regulatory document, but that kind of set the stage, that really emphasized where we wanted to see reinvestment, which was really largely on our commercial corridors, right? So times haven't changed in that regard. We had 5 different priorities, one being Clear Creek Crossing, one being the TOD, one being 38th Avenue, Wadsworth, and Kipling. Those remain the same. I would maybe suggest that we've made progress on at least some of those corridors, maybe not all of them, and more is in the works. But once we had and we adopted 3 sub-area plans, right? So a 38th Avenue sub-area plan, a Fruitdale sub-area plan, and a Northwest TOD around our Ward Road Station sub-area plan. That was a recommendation straight out of the first NRS as well. And then from there, with those kind of planning documents in place, we really started to kind of, I'll say, unwind our zoning code, right? We had a zoning code that really relied heavily, like many communities did and to some extent still do, on negotiated zoning. So if you wanted to do something in Wheatridge, essentially, you knocked on the city's door and you said, this is what I want to do, and you went through a negotiated plan development to get approval to do just that, and only that. So it was a very cumbersome process, and then at the end of the day, resulted in, very certain outcomes, but not very flexible outcomes. I'm not sure if it was specifically reflected in the first NRS, but I think developers, love them or hate them, I guess, but they like predictability, and they like streamlined timelines. So that, in my mind, with good planning documents in place that had a lot of community input and involvement, that I think the community should feel more comfortable getting a regulatory framework in place that doesn't rely as much on a cumbersome plan to get development negotiated zoning process with an uncertain outcome, because developers' money, to your point, Richard, can flow to Westminster, it can flow to Wheatridge, and it's fairly agnostic to where it goes, as long as there's some certainty of the outcome and a certain return on investment. So we created mixed-use zoning districts. We did a slew of other zoning code amendments. I think we added them up recently, and it was like close to 50 that we've done in the last 10 years to just kind of unwind what was really a cumbersome zoning tool. But most fundamental to that, I think, was creating mixed-use zoning districts that were meant to apply to our corridors. So a mixed-use neighborhood district that was more of a 38th Avenue scale, a mixed-use commercial that was more of a Wadsworth scale, and a mixed-use commercial TOD, which was obviously focused on our station area. And then we went out and we initiated legislative rezonings, right? So we went out to the property owners on Wadsworth and 38th specifically and said, cities considering initiating a legislative rezoning to go to this district, this is what the district looks like. They were involved in crafting the districts as well. And with very few exceptions, the property owners on those two corridors said, yeah, we'll take you up on that if you're going to take that step for us and give us a zoning framework that has more certainty to the process, but still has predictable outcomes for the community as well, right? Because they're cooked into those zoning districts are some really specific design standards and guidelines, so we know what product we're going to get. So that was kind of some of the fundamental things that we did. Wheat Ridge Local Works, which was previously Wheat Ridge 2020, was an organization that was created very soon after the adoption of the first NRS as well, and they've evolved over time, but they've certainly had an impact on the community as well.
Ken, wasn't the Wadsworth plan post-NRS as well? The Wadsworth sub-area plan?
Yep, it was 2006 or 7, yep.
And that's headed toward reconstruction, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So we're nearing completion of the federal environmental impact statement or environmental assessment. That should happen, I think July is the target date for adoption of that decision document. We've pretty much got all of our funding placed to rebuild that facility. We've got a right-of-way consultant hired. We'll start acquiring right-of-way later this year into 2020 and be out to bid in 2020, Lauren, and start construction in 2021 or maybe 2020.
Sorry, Ken, what property are you referring to?
Not property, but the actual road. Wadsworth will be rebuilt. Okay. Yep, from 35th to 47th.
And these were all direct outcomes of the previous NRS?
Direct sort of next steps. There were 10 strategies, and it's a fairly lengthy document, but they're very discrete action items. So a lot of what Ken was just describing was to support sort of an open for business mentality. So the code amendments, the creation of, at the time, Wheat Ridge 2020. So there was the open for business side, and then the desire to attract and retain strong households, so a real focus on home ownership. So Local Works, previously Wheat Ridge 2020, purchased and rehabilitated properties. Our Wheat Ridge Housing Authority became a lot more active in their single-family and homeownership program, so 50 units. Ultimately, the Housing Authority purchased, rehabbed, and sold to income-qualified households. So sort of both the residential and commercial side had a lot of activity after the NRS based on those very specific action steps.
And I appreciate the background on that. My second question then is, given sort of where Wheat Ridge was a decade ago, or a decade and a half, versus where it is now, and the acknowledgement, I think, that we see in the results we've seen so far, that people in Wheat Ridge are okay with where we are now, and that was sort of an overarching message. It is a bit of a fundamental question. Do we need to do a lot right now in terms of changing the way things are? Does this, depending, I guess, on what the final results say, is it really necessary to bring something like this in and possibly adopt more changes to our code? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is it necessary to do this, go through this exercise again?
Well, I mean, the exercise was intended to be in part self-reflective, and I know some council members made that comment on Monday night as well, to say, well, what has gone right, or has anything gone right? If so, what's left to be done? But I think, we're waiting for our consultants to go into a dark cave and tell us those answers in about a month. But I think they've previewed some of them tonight, which is, some of the focus, and I certainly acknowledge it. I mean, I think I'd like to say we've certainly made progress on Wadsworth on 38th. There's a lot of stuff. The Clear Creek Crossing is moving forward with, you can't see it so much as a bunch of dirt moving right now, but there's, there's a lot of stuff happening out there on both the public and the private side of things. And we've got, 3, 4, 5 different development applications that are either getting close to breaking ground or getting entitled around the ward TOD. So there's actually a lot that I think has happened, but 44th still needs work, right? I mean, Kipling still needs work. Wadsworth, still needs work. So I think we're going to hear that in maybe a more focused way in the 2019 version of the NRS. And then I think this other new focus is, the first NRS said you need to start doing some planning, right? we had we literally, and with all due respect to the people that were involved in adopting the plan from 1999, we had a plan that essentially said, and I'm not, this is not opinion, this is what it said, is that we should retain our urban agricultural kind of character, which we embrace. I mean, we've done in that intervening time kind of a comprehensive rehaul to support urban ag, but it literally said you should seek opportunities to turn properties from residential back into agriculture. I mean, if opportunities arise. So it was not progressive at all in terms of encouraging reinvestment in the community. But where I was headed with that is, so we've done that new comprehensive plan, which again values our urban ag and our agricultural background. It values our well-established single-family neighborhoods and really focuses on the commercial corridors, as well as infill residential. And we did the sub-area plans. And I think now, from a planning perspective, the recommendations that we're going to hear are more, neighborhood focused, has been alluded to tonight by Eric and Thomas.
If I could just respond a little bit to Mr. Larson's question too. Part of the fun thing about being a consultant is you get to every project you get to work on is an opportunity to learn something new, to hone our craft and what we do. And we work nationally, so literally, from Oregon to Georgia, and all points in between. Haven't made Hawaii yet, but maybe someday we will. We've done Alaska though. But one of the things that we tend to do is only end up in places where there's like some existential issue. So when you go to a place like Erie, Pennsylvania, or you go to Canton, Ohio, it's an existential crisis. Like, is this city going to make it? Is it going to be here in 50 years as a municipal corporation? That's a legitimate question to ask in those places. Or doing affordable housing work in Park City, right? What's your median home value?
About 1.4 million.
Okay, right. It's it's so big. It's so hairy. Those are that's what we're used to working on as consultants, and that's fun. And so it was probably a few months into the project in Wheat Ridge. And of course, the original NRS was a bit of an existential crossroads question as well, right, at that time. And so we were loaded for bear when we came into this project, because that's what we're used to walking into. And it was when we really figured out, we figured out as a group, not just Thomas and me and Charles, our colleague Charles, but also these guys in the committee, when we think we really figured out how to do this project was when we figured there is not an existential issue here, right? And that was the implications of that were what they were from the content side of the project. But as a matter of, I think, locating the purpose of the project, which I think is what your question was getting to, it's almost refreshing, because then you start to say, okay, well, wait a minute, this isn't about an existential crisis. This is just about good governance. It's about continuous improvement. It's about always checking in on how we're doing, not waiting until the house is on fire to ask how are we doing, but doing it under better circumstances. So what we've told Ken and Lauren and Patrick for a while now is one way to think about some of the recommendations is like going from Wheat Ridge Planning version 2.0 to Wheat Ridge Planning version 3.0. It's not ripping up Wheat Ridge Planning and doing something different. It's also not doing no change at all. It's just incremental improvements to keep getting better. And that's a very luxurious position to be in as a city, I will tell you. after being in Erie, Pennsylvania, in Canton, Ohio, and those kinds of places. So I think that the city council and the staff here advocated for that approach to say, let's check in on things, when we're not in trouble, is a pattern that is, and a practice that is not as prevalent in America as you would like it to be. So credit should be to go to Wheat Ridge for that.
And the only thing I'll add is that I think a lot of the projects that have come out of the original NRS, they take a lot of time, right? So the corners, we started working with that developer in 2012, and they won't be fully built out for another few years. So that's a 10-year time horizon. And that NRS document feels very relevant to me, right? That's our sort of roadmap. And we routinely will start maybe a staff report or a policy discussion with, in 2005, council adopted this document that said such and such. But it's becoming less and less relevant in sort of the minds of the citizens. And I don't know how many of you all have even read that document, right? So, and that's fair because it's 15 years old. So to the extent that we're trying to check in, we just want there to be, if there's a guiding policy document that starts all of our stories and all of our policy making, we want it to feel relevant, and we want the community to feel ownership of that document, and certainly the volume of public participation, even if the outcome was the exact same. I think just sort of checking back in and having a new sort of groundswell of the community that feels like, yeah, this is our document. We get what you're talking about when you say in 2019 council adopted the NRS. That gives us a little bit better starting point where we're sort of all coming from the same page when we're moving forward to approve a development or approve a code amendment or launch into a new planning framework.
I just have a couple questions again, and part of this is probably because this is like my first meeting. Some of this is a little new to me. But one comment on just kind of everyone's thought process about this is, like, certainly I think, we're not in any dire position, and it's good to check in with your community, but there is a very real activity around our borders and the risk, and I think you've said this a couple times, is if we don't proactively look at what we want, and whether it's maintaining or enhancing, it's going to define us rather than us having a role in defining it for our community. So if anything, comes out of this, it's like, I think it's important to say, well, yeah, this is what we want to be in the next year, even if it's only a 10% difference, but like really having an updated active voice and kind of what Wheat Ridge wants to look like. So the question I have is, I was trying to look at your graphics and understand kind of next up with the strategy and the recommendations. So once you develop the recommendations, does that come back to Planning Commission to review? Because I imagine that's kind of the meat of the plan, right?
I think we brought the draft strategy to both council and Planning Commission.
Okay. Because in the memo, it just says, has the potential to weigh in on it in the future, and it seems like you would want the commission to weigh in on what the actual direction, like what all this input results in, is like looking at what you're recommending.
Yeah, there's sort of two things maybe to take apart. One is, what is the review and potential adoption process in May and June of this year? And I think what we were getting at with that particular statement that you referenced was the implications for future work that's going to end up on your desks here as
Right.
Planning Commission, like small area plans, corridor plans, those kinds of things.
So the draft
code
plan
changes.
will come before us.
That's my expectation and understanding.
Okay.
I understand that we have a session in a month on the 18th of April. I have it on my calendar that we're having a special session, may even be food, maybe not. Food.
Sounds like a lot of information then,
I
right?
should never, 'cause I'm a little hungry. But it was my understanding that at that session, we're going to be able to break into some, a little more of the nuts and bolts.
Okay, okay.
The 18th will not at all be about the NRS, just to clarify. It'll be a lot more nuts and bolts of the Planning Commission and procedure and sort of zoning code and the things that affect almost everything else that you do other than the NRS.
But there'll be food.
But we can, as long as people can come at 6.
Yeah, okay. And then just one other detail about that. It sounds like the previous plan it was not regulatory in nature, it was just a policy document, and this will be the same. It's just the outputs or the future planning will be regulatory.
Take the step of adopting the 2005 plan as an element of our comprehensive plan.
Okay.
So to have that kind of enforcement lever. I mean, it's still not a regulatory document, but
Right.
at least you can reference it when you're looking at zoning code amendments and such. And, you know, it'll just, I think the format of this one will tell us, you know, whether it makes sense to consider as adoption as simply a policy document by council, or more formal adoption as an element to the comprehensive plan will be, I think, informed by what it looks like and whether that makes sense.
Well, and maybe to be more specific, like, there's not necessarily going to be any code changes contained within it. It may provide policy guidance to guide future code amendments, but not, so far, I mean, it's, maybe you don't know that answer yet, but so far, that's not kind of the goal.
We're not going to change your code of this document.
Okay, or recommend it, okay. All right, thank you.
I have to go back to this because I'm a little concerned, and I guess I want to talk to the NRS people, or I want them to talk a little bit. I spent my career as a sociologist, and part of what I did was look underneath the words that people said to get at the meaning. What all those graphs seem to say to me, I mean, one interpretation of those graphs is that people are quite satisfied with what they have, but I can't help but think that it's kind of defensive. And so I have, and part of this question is rooted in sitting up there and having developers come in and having neighborhood people sitting in the audience and talking about what's happening to their neighborhoods because of the development. So I guess, here's my question. I finally got to the question. Do the people of Wheat Ridge that you talk to understand what's going on around them? Do they really understand it, and do they see it coming? Or is this a kind of defensive posture? Yeah, we like everything about this. We wish we had more restaurants. I'm asking the NRS people. Yeah, they won't know because they live out on the East Coast.
Well, he lives just in Lafayette, but I think that's a really shrewd observation. So I'm gonna share a story that goes to the code enforcement. So the evolution of this, as we shared, really started with sitting at small tables that felt very relational, and kind of we were asking really high level questions. Unlike this, which is very much like down to some nitty gritty kind of wonky stuff. And in those small table conversations with the people who took time out of their day to talk to us, we heard a lot of complaints about code enforcement. Like, you'd think that was the #1 issue, like Wheat Ridge was just like a cesspool, is what you'd feel sitting at these tables, because everyone who came to the table in this conversational sense, we all have that one neighbor that we have to either walk our dogs by or drive by that just doesn't keep their property up to, the standards that we feel reflect our city. So that's where the conversation started. So we all came off that first round and we're like, oh, this is a code enforcement issue. Like, NRS is going to say, go do more code enforcement. But then by the time we got to the community survey, and we said, when you think of the whole city, how do we look? Like, how do we look? Do we look good? Turns out everyone's like, oh, well, the city looks good. I just have this one neighbor that is a problem. And so when you take the lens from the individual to the city scale, that's sort of where you start to get these areas of like, well, we can all complain in a conversation about our one neighbor. So when you ask about the average citizen's awareness of like civic processes, like engagement, planning commission, you guys get a lot of people sitting in the audience at planning commission that aren't presenting. So in general, the average citizen, it turns out, is not always aware in real time how things are moving through the processes. in the city, and some of it is they're just, it's the 80-20. They're just, they're never going to care no matter how much you like flyer their doors. However, there are a handful of people, who do care from both ends of the spectrum, right? Like they're anxious they have an appetite for change, right? Like they're wanting, like I'm really excited. I found out a wings place is opening basically at the end of my street. I'm really excited. And then there's people who like just, they're the stewards of our heritage. And so the average person really is not in the know on that stuff. And so I think kind of to Mr. Larson's comment, like this document isn't just about like the goalposts of like, hey, Wheat Ridge, like 44th needs some attention and these neighborhood district plans are going to be really helpful. But it's not just the what, but the how. And that how, I think, is going to elevate the civic engagement fabric. And I think some of it is that we have a fairly contentious, those of us with histories in the city, we're a scrappy city. we like to engage. So, there's some engagement phobia for some people who are aware of that, and other people like seek it out, and a lot of people are unaware. So I think the NRS has the potential to say, we can make some changes to the how so that we're going from 1% to 3% to 5% to 10%, so that there is more civic awareness and engagement earlier in the process, so that by the time it's baked and coming up like for council, it's touched more people. Is that kind of answering your question? And in the big regional things, like I've done a lot of regional stuff, very few people get to that level. That's super complicated. And you're lucky if you get the 1% on that, so.
Yeah, that's what leads to my question, is that I think a lot of people are kind of naive about what real change is in a city that's moving as fast as Denver. I just don't think they understand it. So to another concrete question, as part of this NRS program, as part of this NRS initiative, is there some educational component that you're going to tap on at the end of it? Some kind of public relations component, some kind of educational component, some kind of explanation of what's about to happen?
So Kathleen, why don't you jump in for what you wanted to say, and then I can come back to that.
So this touches on your second question a little bit, but is more to your just prior question. A lot of what we heard, kind of as Rachel was saying, like people have that one neighbor that they might want to complain about, but they're generally happy. I think that's part of it, and I think that one of the things that really bubbled up is this neighborhood, I'm not going to remember the right language you used, but like these neighborhood identities and having a little bit more input and maybe not control, but agency in your neighborhood. I think that there are people that are excited for different opportunities or are aware that change is coming, and they might be okay with a style or a zoning change in certain neighborhoods that might not be appropriate for another neighborhood. And I think some of what's coming out of the conversations we've had around these neighborhood identities lends itself to some of the defensiveness maybe tempered, because what might fit somewhere else isn't going to be put upon their neighborhood, or what they want they might be able to affect without having to affect for the whole city. And having some neighborhood engagement also allows for those communications, for more dialogue, for more flow of information. So I think, I don't know where this is going to land, but I think this idea of more neighborhood connection and more neighborhood flow addresses some of that fear, some of that defensiveness, and also provides some of that opportunity. So that's what I've seen.
The saying that we've developed amongst ourselves about Wheat Ridge is the only pattern in Wheat Ridge is there is no pattern in Wheat Ridge. It's a very diverse place. There is, we don't fully understand why there's $1 million house next to a $200,000 house, and it doesn't matter what block of the city you're on. You could have that on any block of the city. It's a very nuanced place. And to your question, there are people here who are naive, asleep at the switch, defensive, there are also people who are change agents themselves, want to see change, and then and they're like, make us Denver tomorrow, please, right? And then there's everything in between. So it's very difficult to generalize about people in Wheat Ridge and what they know about these issues, what they think about these issues. A shortcoming of the way we do business, whether as a city government or a planning commission or a consulting firm on a contract for 11 months or whatever it is that you have to make generalizations, you have to take shortcuts or you can't get anywhere, right? And so I think that's why the model, the unsustainable model we talked about a few minutes ago about doing 50 small conversations in a few months across the city, that's the scale at which the work needs to happen, because the give and take there is where you can inform people, you can show empathy if they don't like what's happening, you can learn from them about what they think and what they want, right? All those things and more take place in those settings that aren't going to take place in a lot of other settings. So that's a lot of the trick of doing this work going forward in terms of managing change at the community level. To your second question, yes, there are two kinds of things that are going to go into this final report. I think they will speak a little bit to what you're asking about. One is sort of the story of what's going on and what that means. And then another is sort of I don't know how to describe it, a manual for participation, right? Things that you need to know as a Wheat Ridge resident to participate in these conversations. Here's how planning works. Here's what the comprehensive plan does. Here's what sub-area plans do. Here's what zoning is. Here's what the code does. So that people can open that and say, okay, I get it. Now I can figure out where something is in the process, or here's where I fit in, because we think that's really important. There's people in Wheat Ridge are very smart, not always knowledgeable about the details of these issues, but they're intelligent. If they given a chance, they could learn it, no problem, right? And so to the extent that we can do that and allow people to turn knowledge into power to participate, we think that would be helpful.
If I could just add one thing, I would say when you think about the next steps, once the plan arrives, I would think that you've got 26 people now in steering committee, you've got 7+ people on planning commission, you've got 9-ish at council, right? I mean, right there you've got 50 people who are quite aware of what the NRS is, quite aware of what some of the planning needs and recommendations will be. I mean, that's 50 people to start pushing. So I think that if you need to educate, utilize those 50 people, you included, go out into the community and make sure that people are aware. But I would say, you know this as well as anybody being on planning commission. If you've got a big hearing that is taking place at the planning commission and you think it's a pretty big deal, you've read your packet, you're pretty prepared, but there's 2 people in the audience at the end of that day. If that's the case, it doesn't feel as if it's somehow been made aware to the public. I hope that the steering committee populates your chambers when those projects come forward, as well as city council. And so I think that utilizing people, having them kind of spread their tentacles and educate could lead to what you are, I think, alluding to. How do we get the word out, kind of word of mouth, person by person, if you will. Probably the best way.
That's a good point, is that, and this is just my opinion, that if there's people that are upset with it, the room is packed. And I've been to not just this city, I work as a landscape architect, and I've been to municipalities where there's people and they're upset about the project. Granted, the opposite is true. When people are happy with the project, there may not be as many. There might just be 2. And so the perception is sometimes hard of what, did the word get out, or are people just generally okay with it?
Right. Wouldn't it be nice to have more people out for a positive support of a project, right? And to help push policy, to help push implementation, to help push funding, to help push budgeting change. It'd be nice.
If the neighborhood districts were in place, that communication channel becomes a lot more cohesive and predictable. So I live in what's identified as Bel Air, even though technically it's Hillcrest, but I'm not going to pick that bone. But so if Bel Air had a district plan and our neighbors had participated over 6 months in that planning process and it had been adopted, through that process, it would elevate probably 10 to 20 people in the Bel Air district who would be informed and engaged and connected. And the community, the city, if the city had grown its capacity for neighborhood engagement, then when something came up in our neighborhood, there would be a communication channel in place. And I think that's it's a softer edge of the district plan idea, but I think it actually ends up contributing to stronger outcomes across the city, because the community, the city just doesn't. We don't benefit from having a monthly utility bill that goes to everyone in our city. We have so many different districts. Like we have communication infrastructure issues that make that type of dynamic exchange of information tricky, which is, I think, kept us at the 1% to 3%. And so again, the neighborhood district idea could, and it would help people understand complicated projects like the TOD and Clear Creek, and overall I think would elevate civic engagement.
I've been sitting here listening to everything, and it's really, really makes you think. First of all, I'd like to thank the steering committee. You've done amazing to get that many people involved. I've been in Wheat Ridge for, and this is just kind of personal, for almost 35 years. And when I moved, now I'm in District 4 over by Kipling, and when I moved here, there was a farm on the corner of 38th and Kipling that had bulls in it. B-U-L-L-S, I talk funny sometimes. It had bulls in it, okay? And then a gas station came, and now they're building this big gas station. I mean, there have been a lot of changes. And at first I thought, no, I don't want the bulls to go away. But the changes that have happened have been for the better. In the long run, they have been amazing. What they've done at 38th and Kipling is amazing. I mean, I saw that deteriorate, and now it's very viable. And now they're doing the 38th and Wadsworth. I mean, there are a lot of good things. I think people are afraid. What they want, and I know, I have talked to people. I actually ran for city council, I think, 4 years ago, and I walked my district and talked to people. And I think what they want the growth. They want commercial. They want the corridors to develop. But they want to go home to their street and still feel the same. And all of the neighborhoods, when I walked into some of the areas in my district that you don't drive through, I was amazed at the difference that I found. And you were talking about $1 million house next to a 200,000. That's one of the characters of you, wherever you go. It's not just the same every place you go in the city. And the areas of the city, the east side versus the west side, they have their own character. The neighborhoods, people want to go home and they want to feel. They want that feel, but they like what's happening generally. So I just wanted to throw that out. I wasn't surprised at what I read here. I thought I was going to find some surprises. And, it's really what I've been hearing. I just think the city's really come a long way. The only question I have, and I keep hearing, when I read it on paper, they talk about the cost of housing in Wheat Ridge is not very high. But then when I talk to people, they say, oh man, I had to go north. There's no way I could afford a house in Wheat Ridge. So I'm very confused about that.
Wheat Ridge has historically been, at least in modern times, less expensive place to buy a house. And to some extent, that's still true. But we've got some data behind us here, if you want to look at it on the way out, that says that average single-family sales prices have gone up faster. The rate of appreciation has been stronger in Wheat Ridge in over a decade, the last decade, than it has been in its neighboring locations. So that's on the home ownership side. Then there's also the rents. And so it's also true that Wheat Ridge has some of the lowest rents in the metro area as well. So I wouldn't say Wheat Ridge is a cheap place to buy a house at all in 2019. In fact, I went out with one of our steering committee members who's a realtor, and we looked at a dozen listings one day, and that was such an incredible education. If anybody can do that, I would highly recommend you do it. Just take a day or a half a day and go see some listings to see what's going on out there in the market. Because yes, it is getting increasingly expensive here.
I guess it's just not even now, but 4 or 5 years ago. There were people that, actually, a couple people who worked at the city said, I wanted to buy a house here, but I couldn't afford it, so I had to go to Arvada, or I had to go to North Glen, or Thornton, or something like that. And my house, I wouldn't buy it today, because it's crazy. It's just a ranch. And there's no way I would buy it for what it's going for. So I'm just amazed.
It's all in the land. It's all in the land.
Your prices have changed rapidly recently. Others have changed prior, moving west. You guys are changing rapidly now.
It's, yeah.
Any more questions?
I want to, this is a good thing. I'm going to compliment you on something. But then you backed off. Rental inspections. Rentals were sort of dismissed in this. You talked about short-term rentals and suggested it wasn't a code problem. I think if you look at short-term rentals, it's not a question of a code problem. There are all sorts of other things going on with rentals. I mean, this isn't New York City, but if you look at what's happening with rentals, or with like Airbnb in New York City, where people are, well, I stayed in an Airbnb in Brooklyn one time. There was a rent-controlled building, which is kind of illegal. But so you kind of dismiss short-term rentals and by saying it's not a code violation, nobody complains about them. But I think there are other issues involved there. And the rental housing, I remember when you came in November, you made an issue of, or you pointed out how much rental housing there is here. And then again, on the basis of code enforcement, you kind of dismissed it and said, well, people are keeping up their properties. But I can't help but think that there's more to rental properties than just whether somebody keeps it up or not. I think it has an impact on resale values of other houses in the neighborhood. I think it has an impact on neighborhood identity. It's hard to have an identity if if 6 houses on your block are rentals. You can't get that kind of engagement that you say you're going to get. So I would encourage, I guess it's the NRS, I would encourage to really look at a rental inspection program. And I can tell you in California, it's not called rental inspection, it's called renter's rights. And they inspect the buildings. There are lists of renters' rights, like if you have to move, how soon do you get notice? How long does it take to get things repaired? So I think to think about it as just a kind of punitive measure for rental property owners is maybe not a complete way to think about it. I think it has other major impacts on how a city looks, how a city operates, how neighborhoods feel, and a whole bunch of things like that. So I applaud you for recommending it, but I don't know about this backing off stuff. I think you should go back and fight for it. And as long as I'm on to things that aren't there, I think code enforcement too, your data, your surveys said well, everybody seems to be happy with code enforcement, or it's that one noisy neighbor. I've always complained about code enforcement and where I used to live and now here, because it depends on citizen complaints. The only way I can get code enforcement to come to my neighborhood is if I call them and complain about my neighbor. Now, again, if you're trying to get neighborhood identity, civic engagement, I'm not going to call the code enforcement about a noisy neighbor in my neighborhood. My next door neighbor decided to start to collect junk cars, and I had a little chat with him. Wasn't very friendly after a while. Down the street, there was an RV parked on Pierce with a long extension cord going in the basement window of the house. And it sat there for probably 2 weeks on Pierce. It's a motorhome. Now, I didn't call the police on that motorhome because it's a block away from my house. But the police drive by there all the time. So I think maybe the city should look at the whole code enforcement issue and start to raise questions about, do we really want a system that's based on neighborhood complaints, which undermines neighborhood solidarity? Or do we want a system where the city takes some responsibility to actually go around and identify code enforcement violations on their own? And so I think code enforcement, people's reactions to code enforcement may come down to the fact that in order for it to work, they have to complain. And so they think, well, everything's fine. So I would just throw that out there as something to consider. And NRS might want to take it out.
I would maybe just say, I think if the four of us were writing this document in a cave by ourselves, and what we predicted the outcome of this process to be was very different than I think the outcomes that we've all heard about tonight. A lot of the topics that you've just mentioned, a lot of the sort of specific code amendments, ADUs, short-term rentals, inspection, renters' rights, code enforcement, I think, and speaking for myself maybe, I thought for sure that's just all this document was going to be. And, you know, we're not representing that the survey was scientifically, valid, whatever. It was robust for sure, it's a data point, but I think we have to listen to sort of this robust engagement that we've heard, and certainly the outcomes are a little different than I predicted that they would be in my own head, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't still be on the table of the conversation. A lot of the things that you heard about tonight and the things that you mentioned are resource issues, so that is certainly one of the next kind of conversations, right? If we have council's strategic plan, and code enforcement has long been a part of council's strategic plan, but what resources do we need to make it be a different approach, I think is sort of that next conversation.
Did you guys, just to his point and your point as well, it's like, I assume there was kind of like a technical data assessment that, like looking at, I know you don't want to just count violations, but like looking at what has our record been for code enforcement requests? Like, is it isolated in certain areas? Are we getting a high number of requests for ADUs? Again, I'm going to plead like newbie here, but, I would imagine you're getting a community opinion on what they think, but also kind of looking at what your data or the results of your operations are telling you as well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And so our review of that stuff would not contradict what we're telling you here tonight.
Right. So it supports that it's not really a big issue in those cases.
Right. Yes. Short answer, yes.
Do you know if one of the items talked about whether residents thought their, people's neighbors' yards look clean? I didn't see anything that addresses parking. Parking is usually associated with ADUs and short-term rentals, where there's people getting dropped off, cars coming by all the time, parking, that kind of issues. Is that something that is going to be addressed? And then the second question I have is, back to Commissioner Peterson's question about the island. since we don't live on an island, we're very interconnected. I would say we're almost interdependent. I'm not sure that any City of Wheat Ridge resident does 100% of their shopping, which means that we're shopping in other nearby cities, we're traveling on the roads in other cities. And my question is there anything in the report that we'll be doing, I guess I'd call it a contrast and compare of looking at, it could be anything. It could be a node in a different city. Obviously, the top three Denver is obviously very huge, but I'm thinking more, Arvada, Lakewood, Golden, and it's like, this is what one of these cities is doing. This is what their node looks like. Here's where we're at. Sometimes, instead of I'm not critiquing you per se, but sometimes telling people this is what you need to do versus here's A, here's B, helps someone to make that decision of like, oh, this is where we're at, seeing, maybe I'm much more of a graphical person, but seeing something like that, or I don't know if there's any GIS, geography type of information that would look at assigning, say, color values for whatever, if it's big box or restaurants, those become a certain color, and then you could quickly ascertain of like, for instance, I've been to a lot of different malls and downtowns throughout the United States, and when developers develop malls, they're very careful that they don't just have 10 restaurants in a row. They understand that it's somewhat like notes of music, and that there's a certain, I guess I'd say, prescription of how you place restaurants, and thinking about times of day and how that interacts with residents, so mixed use being a good thing. But anyway, that's my rambling and thoughts.
We're not exactly sure how the final document will present information just yet, or pose possibilities or different opportunities. So I might just sort of punt on that one for now. To your first question about parking, we didn't specifically ask that question in that way. That was maybe a little bit too down in the weeds for what we have done to date. But the parking consideration in the specific ADU conversations that we had was there for sure over the last couple of days. So if Thomas might want to add to that. Do you want to add to that?
Just that I would say that when we did ask about neighborhood, quality of the neighborhood character, and how well do your neighbors maintain their housing, our presumption is that if somebody did have cars parked in their front yard and or they weren't maintaining their house, that would probably fall into a more negative category. And so we didn't see it nearly as much as we expected. We had anticipated that to be a bigger issue than it was. So it might have gotten, even though it was nuanced, it might have gotten answered in that survey to the extent that you might be interested in understanding parking, if you will, or cars in the front yard. I would also say, relative to ADUs, we didn't have specific questions on ADUs in the overall survey, but when we got people to the open houses, we did ask them questions about what kind of ADUs, if they were to be considered, what kind of ADUs would you think are appropriate from both a form and a function, who would live there, an elderly parent, a boomerang child, etc., versus a rental. And we also asked different typologies. If it were an independent unit in the backyard in addition to the house, built above a garage, or just a retrofit of an attic and basement. We did ask all of that to get a better understanding. And we also did make the assumption that there would be code that recommended parking, off-street parking, and or the use of on-street parking if that were what that neighborhood had. So we did kind of address that. That'll get a little bit more clear with the next round of input that we put together based on this week. So maybe that'll help you out a little bit.
Any more questions?
I noticed a distinct absence of the word walkability, and I'm wondering why. You made reference to the fact that there aren't many sidewalks in your neighborhood. Yeah, my neighborhood has sort of sidewalks for a while and then no sidewalks. Like if I want to go to Colorado Plus, I have to walk in the street. which is terrible, especially coming home. So I'm just curious, with a nod to Jane Jacobs, why no walkability issues or interests?
We actually had a number of questions on the survey that did address both pedestrianization in the neighborhoods and the corridors. And I will say that sidewalks were ranked the lowest, which meant that people wanted more attention brought to sidewalks for both connectivity and safety. And so it is an issue that we will address. We simply haven't put all of that information together, but of 9 items, that was ranked the lowest, which indicates we need to do something about sidewalks. Yeah.
And I'll add to that sidewalks show up in 2 different places on these boards. One over here, in which we asked people to prioritize what they thought could be addressed at the neighborhood district level. And on we did a fresh sheet for each one of our open houses. So what we have is the ones from last night. And at the neighborhood level, side or walkability and trails, I think, got the most dots on it. So again, people really do feel like it's important, and we've been asking that question. And then over here on the corridors, it was also asked, within the corridors, there's aesthetics and function. And one of the questions on there is, active transportation accommodations as well as accessing transit. And I think pretty much on all of those were pretty highly ranked as important. So they're showing up in kind of smaller ways, not as a big high-level question across, but within each of the things we're looking at, it's kind of baked into, how are we accommodating people who aren't in cars?
There was an interesting question on the survey that asked people if you had a neighborhood node, a little restaurant, a coffee shop or something that was within, say, 5-10 minutes walking distance from your house, would you consider using that? And some people can fear a small commercial establishment being close to their house. I mean, there are reasons for that. There'll be parking, they'll have trash out back, etc. But it was an overwhelming response that people would take advantage of that and do just what you said, get out of their cars. That was helpful for us to know, because it can help us plan what could be on the corridors near the neighbors, not in the neighborhood, but near the neighborhood, so they could walk.
Are there any more questions for the consultants or the steering committee? Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate coming out here. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, are we adjourned?
No. We have one more order of business
Voting.
tonight. So every meeting, one more quick order of business. So board appointments are typically made every March. So after appointments are made, your bylaws require that you elect your chair and your vice chair. The same person cannot serve in the same role in successive years, but the chair for the last year was Alan Bucknam, and he's no longer on the board, so anybody can be the chair. The process is also outlined in the bylaws, so it's not a nomination. We'll pass out a piece of paper in a minute. Secret ballot, you'll first write down who you want as the chair, and then we'll tally that. Somebody will become chair, and then we'll do the same process to determine a vice chair. The vice chair's role is essentially the chair's role is essentially to run the meeting. The vice chair would run the meeting in the absence of the chair. In the absence of both, it's the person who's been on the board the longest. So, any questions on that process? Yes. What's that? We will. Do you have paper? Tammy has paper. So if you would now write down and then fold in half the person. Yes, all of you vote. The person who should serve as chair. You can discuss if you want. You can't technically nominate per your bylaws, but I know we have some newer members, sort of a variety of tenures here.
I'm not sure I understand. You can't nominate somebody, but we can discuss.
Right. So I'll read you the bylaws, and then you'll Election of officers. A majority vote of all members present of the commission shall be required to elect a chair and vice chair. We passed that. We have a majority of folks here. Chair shall be elected on an annual basis at the next regular meeting following appointments in March. This shall be the first order of business after public hearings at the meeting, shall be held by secret ballot without nomination. Until one person has received votes of a majority of all members present, successive ballots will be taken. After selection of the chair, the commission shall then choose one of its members as vice chair. The vice chair shall be selected in the same manner. The same member may not serve in the same role in successive years. And I think Amanda was our vice chair, so both people who were, yeah, so fair game for anybody that's present.
So we elect a chair and then the chairman elects.
No, and then we do the same process to elect a vice chair. Yeah, just give us one name for, yeah. Where'd Tammy go? Come on. Aren't you our counter? Yeah, but you're gonna collect them, right? Thank you. So it's a long night. Feels more complicated than. So Amanda was appointed to fill the vacancy on council, and so we do still have one. Yeah. So Emery and Alan did not renew their terms, and that's why Melissa and Jahi are here. Thank you. Amanda then subsequently got appointed to council to fill an open seat there, Tim Fitzgerald's seat, and so now there's an active vacancy for Planning Commission posted. So we have 7 right now. We'll have an 8th once that posting is closed. I don't know. All handled through the clerk's office. There are 4, I think I was on there the other day, there's 4 openings, so let your friends know, let folks know. We now have an engaged citizenry through this NRS process, so for anybody that's watching at home, we have 4 openings on boards and commissions. Try and buy you time, Tammy.
Lauren, then if you wouldn't mind.
Yes.
I'm a little slow on this whole special meeting and food thing.
Yes. Oh, yeah, let's talk about that.
I'm kidding about the food, although it would be nice.
No, yeah,
But
it's on our agenda.
Tell us again about what we're going to discuss.
Sure. So we always like to give you guys a preview of the upcoming meeting dates. So today's the 2nd March meeting. April 4th, we will have a planning commission meeting. We have 3 items for the agenda, a master sign plan, a subdivision plat, and then a combination outline development and specific development. So variety, 3, a zone change, a plat, and a master sign plan. No. That one starts at 7 at our normal scheduled time. So April 18th is what I had proposed as a training session. We try to do that every 1 to 2 years. Primarily, often it's sort of just with our city attorney and includes how to manage the meeting, what does it mean to have ex parte contact, quasi-judicial versus ministerial actions, just good sort of training on the role and responsibilities that you have as commissioners, sort of the hat that you now wear that is privileged as a planning commissioner versus a private citizen in terms of public testimony kind of thing. We'll also probably talk about, in the spirit of, all your meetings are televised, in the spirit of educating ourselves and the public, we'll probably do a little bit of the sort of the fundamentals of difference of zoning and land use. What's the difference between mixed use and planned development? Why are we seeing mixed use? Or some of that history, right? What does a plat do? What does it not do? What do you guys typically see? What do we typically review administratively? What are our guiding documents as of right now? So some of those fundamentals too. And then if we have time, that's probably a pretty full agenda. If we have time, we can talk about sort of what's going on in the city, sort of the state of the city stuff. What I had proposed is if folks are available at 6, we could do a dinner before we go into the official training session. So that's an option. The official training session will be in here, probably set up in the round like this, public meeting, so it would be televised. We'd have it as a resource for folks. We have one staff person who can't be there, so he'd be able to view it. Anybody who can't, has a conflict, we haven't heard from everyone yet, but if you haven't responded to Tammy's email about your availability on the 18th, and specifically at 6 p.m., let her know, and then as we get closer, we can make that food order if it makes sense, or sort of hammer out those logistics. Yeah, does that help?
Well, I'd just like to say I think this is a fantastic idea.
Good.
I attended the regional planning commissioners
Oh, sure. The
out in
DOLA
Golden back in November, and
planners
Richard and I
workshop.
were there, and certainly gained a lot from it because our
Good.
city attorney was had one of the parts of that.
Mhm.
Learned a lot about it, but I think it's going to be helpful for us, certainly for me, to refresh on some of these things because they're, well, especially when you get into things like ex parte discussions, it can.
You can't hear it enough, really,
Exactly,
in your
exactly.
in your role.
And the difference, I think, this time will be it is just us Wheat Ridge folks.
Right.
There were people from all over at that last one, and every town has its own issues.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Great. Tammy, where do we stand on?
Scott is our new chair.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So now we can repeat the process. You just can't vote for Scott. And whoever is elected this time would be the vice chair. As a little data point, the bylaws don't prohibit you from electing somebody who's not present. That has happened before. So next March, yes. Yep.
Has there ever been any discussion about having
No? Like every 6 months?
Yeah, I only say that because there's been some turnover with commissioners. Ideally, it'd be kind of have to somewhat get your feet wet.
Yeah. No, yeah. Oh, that's a good way to fill the time. So staffing update, thank you. Do you want to answer that? Now I forget what our staffing level was the last time that we met, but we had a planner go to Denver in October-ish, and we had a planner retire in December. So we were half staff and more than full caseload, and we are both happy to report that we are fully staffed. So we promoted somebody internally into the Planner 2 role. We have now Planner 1, and most recently, about 3 weeks ago, Senior Planner. 4th week? Yeah, it feels like we signed our cases like on day 1. So we're fully staffed. And at the training, part of the reason for the training session timing too is get our staff on board. So as much team building as training, right? You need to know our faces. You all have new faces here in the last month and year. So yes, full staff, thankfully.
So who's the senior planner?
Stephanie Stevens. So she came to us from McCool Development Solutions. It's a private sector group. So she's been a sort of extension of staff for a variety of smaller communities who don't have a more senior planner on staff. And then prior to that was at Aurora. So doing a variety of projects, development review, worked on the Stanley Marketplace, sort of a good depth of, we're a small department right now. Pre-NRS recommendation. We may grow. We may add 26 staff people, but we need people that can sort of be jack of all trades, and she certainly brings that to us, which has been great.
That's a big, speaking of market holes, that's a big trend right now.
Yeah. Yep.
Market hole?
Like Source and Stanley, and yeah, kind of Avanti.
I think there's one moving now on 38th over by Sprouts.
Where?
I think there's going to be a
The
market hall.
market hall, sort of the multiple vendors under one roof, like the Source. Tammy, do we have a count?
Dan Larson is our vice chair.
Thank you. Staff doesn't have any more new or old business, unless there are other questions.
Is there a motion to adjourn? Vote. Okay.